Hey everyone, Cleo here, and today we are talking about the series that I've abandoned along the way. So this is the fourth video that I'm doing in a particular series in which I talk about my progress with book series. The series that I am caught up with, the series that I've completed, the ones that I'm in the middle of, and now the ones that I am abandoning. So somewhere along the line, I've decided that I don't have an interest in this series, or I very much disliked a book in this series, for example, and decided not to continue. Now for some of these I'm going to have a super lengthy explanation, for some of these I'm going to have close to nothing to say about them, so bear with me if I'm rambling on about a particular one for quite some time, especially since I'm going to start off like that. So in alphabetical order, here we go. First up, the All Souls Trilogy by Deborah Harkness. So this is probably one of the most controversial ones on this list. It is one that is very much a beloved series. It is also one that BookTube is starting to discover, I feel like. And it's going to be interesting to see their reaction to it or not, because I feel like the vast majority of people who read this love this series, and then you have the people who hate this series. Basically, the All Souls Trilogy is often compared to Twilight. It's often referred to as Twilight for adults, and I can definitely see that. We are following our protagonist Diana, who is this girl who was brought up in a witchy household. However, her parents passed away when she was still a young girl. They were persecuted by people who believed witches to be evil, and as a result, she very much shies away from her witchy heritage. She doesn't want to be trained in witchcraft. She just wants to be a regular human like everybody else. She very much dives into the academic world, and at the beginning of the story, she goes to Oxford to do some research into alchemical texts in order to vie for a position at Oxford as a teacher. Now, as she's going through these alchemical texts, she stumbles upon a rare manuscript, has a reaction while touching it, and as a consequence, all of the supernatural beings in Oxford take notice, amongst whom being a vampire called Matthew, with whom she will develop a romantic relationship. It very much feels like Twilight, meaning that it also has those things that a lot of people were drawn to when it comes to Twilight. It has that sort of like angsty romance that was at the center of Twilight. It has the entertainment factor. It has the plot twists and turns. It has a very interesting world, I believe. I do definitely like the whole idea of this world which has demons, vampires, and witches in them, which has these sort of like established rules between these three races. I love the exploration of the house of Diana. Diana back home has this sort of like magical house that basically has its own personality, but I was very much annoyed with sort of the negatives that I find there to be in Twilight, the sort of negatives surrounding the sort of stereotypical representation of vampires as these overpowering, overprotective alpha male characters. And whereas originally I thought that our protagonist Diana, being such a strong independent female character, could be perfect counterpoint to that type of strong male alpha character, I felt like as the story progressed she became less and less interesting. Her world started to revolve just around Matthew, it seemed. All of the things that made her an interesting character to start off with, I felt like we lost them along the way. Aside from that, she's one of those characters that she has shirked magic her whole life, but she turns out to be like super powerful and to have access to like every single magical power in the world, which I also didn't appreciate about this read. So I debated continuing because to some extent I want to see what happens in their storyline. To some extent I want to see what happens in this romance, how the romance develops, but not enough, I think. I really read that first book. I don't want to continue like that with the rest of them. I did start the second series of the TV show, but actually I only watched the first episode and then I lost all interest in it. So I think I'm just gonna let that lie. I don't need to re-explore it. Second series, I don't have much to say about it. This is the Andromeda series by Michael Crichton. If I'm correct, he only wrote one Andromeda story, so he only wrote the Andromeda Strain, which I read last year. This is a pandemic book, but it didn't really fulfill the need that I had for a pandemic book, I guess, because it didn't really feel reminiscent of our pandemic situation at that time. It is a story in which a satellite, I guess, or something like that, returns from Mars or the moon, I don't remember from where, somewhere outer space, and it has like pieces of dirt from that planet on it, and in that dirt there's some sort of a virus or something that affects the humans around the area where the satellite dropped. The fact that it felt very sci-fi, very surreal, meant that it wasn't really hitting the spots that I needed at that point in time, and aside from that I just felt that it was quite boring. I like Michael Crichton. I've read a lot of Michael Crichton's, but some of his works work for me and some really don't. And this one, I don't know, there was something super dry about the way in which this was written, whereas a lot of times with his protagonist, for example, I feel like they really bring life to the story. In this case, I really didn't have that sort of connection with the protagonist, and a lot of the sections are written in sort of like report style, very dry style that didn't work for me. There is a sequel, I think it's a sequel, but it was written like last year or the year before that, so way past the passing away of Michael Crichton. I don't know whether it's based off of notes from Michael Crichton or whether it just serves as an inspiration point, but I'm not interested. Next, another one that I can go over super quickly, and that is Arcana. I don't know by who. This was a manga series that I read when I was a teenager. I read a couple of volumes within this manga. I don't really know what it was about. I think it's fantasy manga, and I think there are dragons involved. But yeah, I lost interest, and as the years went by, I never really checked up on whether new issues came out. Now I know that I haven't read all of them, but I'm also not interested in revisiting it. Moving on to another controversial one, I guess, and that is The Cemetery of Forgotten Books by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. So this is a very beloved series. Back when I read it, it was also a very beloved one here in Belgium, for example. In general, it's not just a series that, you know, only book lovers know about. It is a book that everybody basically has heard of at some point in time. So the first book, The Shadow of the Winds, is the one that I read, of course, and it's also the only one that I really know anything about. So I don't know what the overarching story is of the series, for example. But so in Shadow of the Wind, our protagonist is brought to this cemetery of forgotten books. I think it's a sort of library by his father, and his father tells him, you can pick one book out of this entire collection to take home with you. He is very much drawn to this one particular volume, and so he takes that volume home with him, and then the story is about us exploring the story within a story, exploring the story of that particular book, and how the reality of that book is starting to intermingle with his reality. I was very much bored for a very long section of the book, and around the time when I was starting to get involved within the reading of the book, I didn't like some of the choices plot-wise, and I felt like the story really rounded off way too quickly, which is something that I always dislike, and so I decided that this was not for me. I was not going to continue. It's a book about books that I don't like. It happens. They exist. Next up, another one that I'll go over very briefly, and that's the Cresta Manche series by Diana Wynne Jones. This is a middle grade fantasy series. It's portal fantasy. I think they are like companion style stories. I basically always think of this series when people mention the Wayward Children series by Shauna Maguire, because it just kind of reminds me of that. It is about children going through portals to other worlds, but I haven't read the Wayward Children series, so I have no idea whether there's actually a reason for me to believe that. But I think we probably follow a different child every book, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. I read a couple of these. I don't think I read all of them, and I definitely didn't, like, there was no particular order to them, I think. So I think I enjoyed them when I was a child, but this is really when I was a child. I was probably like 12 or 13 or something when I was reading these types of books, and so I have no interest in continuing or completing my collection in that sense of and reading all of them. Then we have another sort of like beloved series, but I think that I am definitely not alone here, and that is the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So this is another sort of like standard fantasy series and fantasy classic series. Basically, C.S. Lewis dates from around the same time as J.R.R. Tolkien, I believe. But I didn't grow up on this series. I never read them when I was a child. I didn't know the stories when I was a child. The movie came out when I was at university, I think. And so I was only introduced to the story at that time, and I only read the book at that time. And at that point in time, it just really didn't do anything for me. It really just didn't. It was boring, it was way too moralizing, and yeah, it didn't work for me. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, this is another middle grade portal fantasy, basically, in which we have these 5 children who basically, I think they are orphaned at the beginning of the story, and so they move in with their uncle, I guess, who lives in this sort of like big mansion, and in that mansion they find a wardrobe which turns out to be a portal to the magical land of Narnia, which is this kingdom that is kind of being ruled by an evil queen, I think, at that point in time, and they are going to try and help the residents of Narnia to get things back and working, I guess. Next up we have Cities of the Welt by Alex Phoebe. So this only has 1 book out at this point in time, which is Mordew. I was expecting a whole lot from Mordew, and that's maybe the reason why I had to abandon it. So this is very much a dark fantasy, and it does definitely deliver on that, but I was expecting more of a sort of like literary fiction aspect to it as well. I don't know what I was expecting. To some extent, I guess I was expecting like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but I also disliked Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for a big portion of the page length. But I guess with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, it just ended in a way that I had to respect it, whereas I didn't have that overwhelming wow feeling at the end of Mordew. I basically just felt like, did I struggle through this entire page length just for that? So I do definitely think that the ending is one of the stronger points to this book. I feel like the beginning and the ending are the strong points to this book, and the middle section is just where it totally lost me. So this is definitely a dark fantasy. Basically, our protagonist, I think he's called Nathaniel. He is living in the slums. His father is sick, and so he every day goes out into the mud to try and find these sort of like live organisms that he can then trade for money, that he can then use to buy medicines for his father. Through circumstances, he gets involved with the master of the city of Mordew, and the master kind of recognizes huge potential in Nathaniel and kind of wants to break that potential. So it kind of is a power play between the master and Nathaniel. However, Nathaniel for a big part is not really aware that there is a power struggle going on. It is a very dark, gloomy world, dark, gloomy story. It is very much different from most fantasy because it uses a lot of fantasy elements that don't harken back to the tradition. You know, it's very much things that the author just came up with, things that are somewhat surreal, like people with shark heads, for example. I don't remember whether it were shark heads, but there were certain heads. People with certain heads are like, but there were like people with animal heads, but I don't remember which type of animal. So those types of elements, the ones that you don't find in most fantasy books. And so originally that interested me because that meant that, you know, I didn't really know where the story was going to go. But for a big part of this book, I have to say that I was really quite bored with it. So yeah, sadly this one didn't really do it for me. I could basically read like 10 pages of this at a time, and then I was already falling asleep. So yeah, I struggled through it, and I didn't feel like it paid out enough for that, so I will not be continuing. Next up we have the Damned Duology, I think, by Chuck Palahniuk. That's a weird pronunciation that I gave there, but Chuck Palahniuk, I guess. I don't know how to pronounce the last name, I'm afraid. I don't really remember what this is about. I remember trying to read the first book, but I think I also even DNF'd the first book, or I slugged through it and then decided that it wasn't worth it. So don't know too much about this, but I don't have an interest. Then we have Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nyan. This is a book that BookTube was very much hyping at the time of its release, and so I gave into that hype and also read it, but for me it didn't fully deliver. So basically this is a story about this girl who is taken into the harem, I guess, of this ruler. This is a world with a caste system, and she's basically bottom of the barrel, so she is just like paper caste, which is just the humans, and then the more demon blood that you have, the higher in society you are. And so the book is very much about these women who are part of his harem having to deal with, having to process their circumstances, what is being done to them, and then in particular about this one relationship that develops between two of these. Now, I at the time felt like the author was kind of shying away from some of the sexual violence within this book by not showing it. So there was a whole lot of discussion about how these women were dealing with what was happening to them, but when it came to the actual act, it was basically a sort of like blank out scene. And I can definitely now see that you would do that to avoid triggering your readers. But I did also feel like it could have just been a blessing, or it could have been a positive to put representation of that kind in there, with a trigger warning, of course, and to then show how they are dealing with those particular circumstances. So I felt like the author kind of shied away from that, and that I would have liked to see her explore the brutality of that situation further. Aside from that, I really didn't buy into the romance that ensued. I didn't really feel like there was much basis for their romance. I didn't really feel like there was much attraction between the characters, for example. And so I wasn't really sold on it. Then we have the Glass Trilogy, I believe, by Mary V. Schneider. This is basically a series that I started because I had read the Poison Study series, the original trilogy. The other one wasn't out at that time. And then I also read the Healer Duology, and I enjoyed both of these. I really enjoyed Poison Studies at that time, but when I got around to reading Glass, I don't know whether I was just like out of YA fantasy by that time, or whether it was just the fact that this was the third series by Mary V. Schneider that I was reading, but I just felt like it wasn't really as good. So I didn't really have much interest in it. I think it had a magic system in which you could store magic into glass orbs, for example, but that's pretty much all that I remember of it, and so I never continued. I don't even think I finished the first one. Moving on to Gossip Girl, I did read quite a lot of these. I think I read about 10 of them or so. They are just like super light entertainment, but I will say that even though I read like 10 of them, I always just felt like there wasn't much to them, and that, you know, the TV show was way better, because I feel like the TV show went way more interesting places and way more darker places than what the original books actually went to. And so the books were just like flimsy, shallow, superficial. I didn't really get much out of them. And so I at some point stopped reading them, but it wasn't like a conscious decision. I just at this point in time saw like, oh, there were 3 more books in that series that I didn't read, and then was like, yeah, but I'm definitely not going to reread Gossip Girl or to continue with those final 3, because I really have no interest. Next up, another Diana Wynne Jones, and this is Howl's Moving Castle. This is a recent one. I think I read it either this year or last year. So Howl's Moving Castle, the animated movie, is one of my favorite movies, but the book sadly wasn't able to deliver on that. I just got quite bored with the book. I was quite ready for the book to be over midway through. So in this one we are following Sophie, who is enchanted or basically cursed by this sort of like evil witch, and so she sets out to look for the wizard Howl to get his help to bring her back to her normal self. However, she's not able to discuss her circumstances with anybody, so she decides to become his housekeeper in the hopes of being able to get some information about magic along the way and be able to fix her situation. Basically, reading Howl's Moving Castle just made me want to watch Howl's Moving Castle. Next up, a rare exception, that is Legion by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson is one of my favorite authors of all times, but Legion does not work for me. So Legion is a detective-style novella series. I think there are like 3 novellas, and they're also bundled together in one collection if you want to get it like that. I read one of these novellas, and basically our protagonist is sort of like, I'll describe it as he has multiple personality disorder, but each of his personas is basically, he has all of their knowledge, all of their skills. And so if he needs knowledge or skills on a certain topic, he will develop a new persona basically, so that that persona keeps that knowledge and that skill fresh. And so that way he's able to be like super powerful basically. But in essence it is a detective style story, and I like the magic system. I like that whole exploration of the personas and the way that worked, but that's basically everything I liked about it. I didn't care about the plot at all, so I didn't really have a good time with that one. Then we have another beloved least book, and that is the series London Below, starting with Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. I don't know, it is the only Neil Gaiman that I've read, but I haven't wanted to dive into any others because the writing style just isn't for me, I guess, because in essence this should have been a book for me. It is urban fantasy, it is set in London. I was like, heck yeah, give me an alternative magical London. But I didn't like it. It was too whimsical for me. There was too much, like, it was too innocent to some extent, let's call it, I guess. It just felt too much like a children's book, I guess. And so I didn't really get anything out of it. I didn't like the writing style. I didn't feel like there was a whole lot to the story that elevated it beyond that. And so sadly, I didn't really get anything out of it. Next up is a contemporary, or like a romance, and that is Me Before You. This is a romance series basically with disability representation in it, or at least in the first one, but it's a type of disability representation that disabled people don't really like. And so it's basically a story that centers the story of a caretaker rather than centering the disabled person themselves. Our protagonist, Lou, is this sort of like quirky, bumbly person who doesn't know how to hold on to a job, I think. So she gets a job being a caretaker for a paraplegic patient, and I think he's this sort of like grumpy, moody guy who doesn't seem to get a lot of joy out of life, and of course meeting her changes all of that. This is very much a story that has very stereotypical ableist views on disability and ableist portrayal of disability, and a very typical disability storyline, and it centers the caretaker, as I said in the beginning. So I did enjoy the first one for what it was, and when I found out that there were sequels, I was like, but I have zero interest in exploring this story beyond what the first book presented us with. But so next up we have Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I like the concept behind this story. So basically the author, Ransom Riggs, I think his name is, he acquired a box of photos, of old photos, or like multiple boxes, I don't really remember, and some of these are like quite creepy old pictures, and he decided to write a story based on those pictures. He got inspiration from those pictures to write this story. But aside from that being a very interesting way to get to a story, and besides the fact that, you know, these pictures are interesting to look at in correlation to the story itself wasn't really interesting. So I think I only read the first one and I never continued. Maybe I read the second one, but I really didn't get much out of them. Another one that I'm going to go over very quickly is Red Sparrow by Jason Matthews, I think. And so this is a spy series basically about this Russian female spy who's like super beautiful and who's going to be a sort of like double spy, or our protagonist is going to try to turn her into a double spy. I like the idea of a spy story featuring a female spy. I grew up with the TV show Alias, for example, and I really loved that. But this story really didn't have the best of writing. I didn't like the writing at all. And all of our characters were really flat, one-dimensional characters that really embraced all of the stereotypes, for example. And so there really was nothing keeping me invested in this series, so I quit after the first book. Next up we have The Sword of Truth by Terry Goodkind. I did really like the first two books within this series. They are very much entertaining, plot-driven reads, which at that point in time I could enjoy just about as much as I would enjoy like a more fully fleshed out, character-focused read, for example. And so I really did quite enjoy the first two of them, but I did feel like they were very formulaic, and I got really quite annoyed with the way in which the romance stayed a sort of like forbidden romance for such a long time, and the way in which we were kind of teased when it came to that romance. I stopped after the fifth one, I think, and well, the fifth one is the one that a friend of mine is constantly complaining about because it doesn't really have a plot. Basically, the entire book is about him building a sculpture. I think I quite enjoyed the fifth one because I felt like it was such a break from the previous ones, and that it actually did take its time to dive more into certain thematics or into the inner mind of our character or something like that. But having said that, I did never continue past that one, and at this point in time I know that Terry Goodkind is not very well regarded within the community, and that his works are seen as being very unoriginal, which I can definitely see. They're definitely not masterpieces of fantasy or anything like that. Moving on to the Dark Star Trilogy, which only has one book at this point in time, and that is Black Leopard and Red Wolf. I tried to read this twice. I mean, I finished it twice, but the problem is that I I still don't really know what happens in this book. So this is African fantasy, and I believe that it uses sort of like traditional African storytelling. And that, I guess, is part of the reason why I couldn't follow. I'm assuming because I'm not acquainted with that style of storytelling, that I was just lost more easily. And even though I had combined the audio and the physical at some point, because originally I listened to the audio, then I felt like, whew, I zoned out for that. So I combined audio and physical. I still felt like I was lost half of the time. In this one, we're following the character called Wolf, who is this sort of like tracker, and he has like an impeccable record. He needs to go and find a child, I believe. And that's all I know about the story. It is very brutal. It has very brutal, gory scenes. It also has very vivid, visceral sex scenes. But that's about all that I remember. Same can be said for the next one, which is The Dark Tower by Stephen King. The Dark Tower is very much a beloved series, but honestly, guys, that first book, oh, what? I don't know. If you are somebody who has read The Dark Tower and who loves it, can I just skip the first book now? I mean, I vaguely remember what it's about, but I read it twice as well, I think. I listened to it twice because I don't have it physically, and I zoned out for like 3/4 of the book, I feel like. All that I can tell you is that it is about our protagonist crossing the desert in pursuit of the Man in Black. That's all that I know. That's all that I remember. It is also dark, it is also gory and visceral. It also has weird sex scenes, I think. But I just wasn't following. And I know that a lot of people say that The Dark Tower is amazing, but that the first book is just really bad. But yeah, I'm not putting myself through that first book ever again. So unless I can skip it, I will never read The Dark Tower. Then we have The House of Night by PC and Kirsten Cast. This is a mother-daughter duo that are writing a fantasy series together. This is a vampire YA series. I quite enjoyed it, to be honest. I quite enjoyed that series. Our protagonist is this girl who's somehow marked as a vampire. I think they're marked with tattoos or something like that, but I don't know how the marking happens anymore. But so in any case, she turns out to be a vampire. She's moved into the Vampire Academy, and she turns out to be like Diana from A Discovery of Witches, this sort of like super magically talented individual. Throughout the series, I don't remember much of what happens, but she attracts a multitude of guys, which was nice. Was a nice breath of fresh air. It's very much sort of like polyamorous relationship, with the exception that I think it's just like all the guys who are into her and none of the guys who are then into themselves, into each other, I think. But it was fun, but basically the one thing that I haven't read is the final book, I think. But at this point in time, I'm really not going to revisit the series just to finish that final book. Another typical YA fantasy around the time that I was growing out of YA fantasy is The 100 Queen. In this series, if I remember correctly, our protagonist has fire magic, but you're not supposed to have fire magic. She also doesn't know she has fire magic, but the sort of like emperor or something is coming over to their academy to choose a bride, and his eye falls on our protagonist. And that's when she finds out that somebody has basically been blocking her magical powers all of these years, and that since she will no longer be able to help her with that, she needs to be very wary because nobody should find out that she has fire magic. Very bland, typical YA fantasy that I ultimately didn't have enough of an interest in to continue on with it. This is gonna be my story for like most of the series that are following. Next up, The Immortals. Don't even know the name of the author. Don't know what the story is about. I must have started it. A YA fantasy that I was not interested in. I think it is something to do with like angels or something. Then we have The Pledge, another YA fantasy. This one kind of had my interest more, and I had an intention to continue with it. But I had the sequel on my Kindle I still have it on my Kindle. And I have had it on there for years, and I've never picked it up. So clearly I have no interest in it. I think this is more like darker fantasy, and this world is like ruled by an evil queen, and one of her sons, I think, falls in love with our protagonist. And our protagonist is basically sort of like, I don't know what the link is between the queen and her, but there is some sort of a link. So she is actually sort of like a rival for the queen, but I thought it was interesting. The foreshadowing for the way that book 2 might develop was interesting. But as I said, in spite of that, I never continued. Then we have The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel. This is more like lower age range, I would say like middle grade or like early YA. Has to do with alchemy, I'm guessing, because of the name Nicholas Flamel, but I don't really remember much of it. And I read the first few, I think I read like 3 books or something in this series, but they never really captured my love or anything like that. I never really was super excited about them. So at some point I just stopped keeping up with them. Another random YA fantasy is The Sin Eater's Daughter, and for this one I also really don't remember what this one is about, but so yeah, it's a YA fantasy around that time that I didn't continue with. And then the final one is The Young Elites. This is to some extent the same. It is typical YA fantasy that I just grew out of and that I didn't have enough interest in, but I did continue. I did read the first 2 in this one, so and I think I also read it at a little bit of a later date than some of those others. A lot of those others, the first book I read around the same time in which I was still interested in YA, but this one is definitely one that I read at a later stage in time, and it was a lot darker, I also felt. And I was quite intrigued because our protagonist had this sort of like interesting power. She had the power to create illusions, and she herself was a very dark, tortured soul. And so I thought that that was very different from most of the YA fantasy that I had read, and so I did continue with the second one for that one. But also with that one, I then never finished out the series. I never continued with the third one. I do think that the second one did disappoint me, that whereas the first one got me interested enough to continue on with the second one then just made me think like, nah, in the end it is just a regular YA fantasy and I'm not all that interested in it. So that was that. I've gone through all of these. I feel like for like 3/4 or so of all these, my answer was this is regular YA fantasy that I just didn't have an interest in anymore. But so I hope that this was still an interesting video for you guys. This video definitely makes it clear that YA at some point just didn't become my thing anymore. But it also makes it clear that YA for a very long time was my thing. I wouldn't have tried all of these YA series if it weren't for the fact that I was really enjoying YA at some point in time. But these series are the ones that I've abandoned. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these series and you absolutely love them. Like, don't come at me, please. I can absolutely understand people loving these series. I can absolutely understand why some of these series work very well for other people. But I would definitely be interested in seeing like which one of these most surprise you, or which ones you're kind of like heartbroken about me including in here. But so, this concludes this series of videos, meaning that next year I can just give you one update video about what has taken place in my reading year when it concerns book series. The series that I've been able to make some further progress in the meantime, but maybe also the ones that I've been able to finish in the meantime, and I'm sure the series that I've started since then. But so, I hope you've enjoyed this little series of mine, and see you guys for a future video. Bye!